Today is December 6th. It's 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and this is the time where I'm going to meet with students weekly for natural philosophy study. We're going to be reading and discussing Aristotle's Physics, which is the main text of natural philosophy. The two main texts are Aristotle's Physics and Metaphysics. We're going to start with the physics, work through that, and then God willing, get into metaphysics in the future. In last week's meeting, we had some introductory discussion. We talked about what philosophy is. We talked about the four different sciences that arise based on the way that reason relates to order in the world, in our lives. We said that one way that reason relates to order is that reason seeks to understand the order that exists outside of itself. Reason works to understand the order outside of itself, and that's really what the study of natural philosophy is. It's the pursuit of a knowledge of the order that exists in the natural world. That's natural philosophy. And as I said, the textbook for that is Aristotle's Physics. Natural philosophy, like I said, breaks down into both physics and metaphysics. The word metaphysics, if you think that the word physics means nature or the study of things that are natural, metaphysics means things that are beyond nature, things that are supernatural. That's the study of metaphysics. And so you can see we start with physics because it's dependent on the senses more. We're talking about actual physical natural things, and then we're going to ascend through the physical things to the supernatural things and study them in metaphysics, gain the science of natural philosophy by these studies, and then turn around and come back down into these things. And through the mechanical arts that we learned about last week, we take this knowledge of the natural world and how it actually works according to true wisdom. And then when we get to work in it and start doing things, we order our things in to make them in harmony with what we understand about the science of the natural world. So we're studying to learn the science so that we can then apply and enjoy the benefits of the use of the science. But even more than that, our goal in philosophy is to enjoy the science itself, to understand these things and to contemplate. That means to think about these things, these physical things, and use them to ask the next questions like why and how and so on. Because that thought, that contemplation leads us to the knowledge of God himself, the creator who made them all. So when we see beautiful things in the world, we ask the question, what kind of creator must there be who would make these beautiful things? Or when we see the wisdom in organizing the world and how everything works and that the world continues to go on in a sustainable way for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we can ask what wisdom is this that created and designed this world? And that leads us to thoughts about God and about the attributes of God. So it's not just to understand nature, not just for practical purposes, but also to think about philosophical things, to contemplate and think about things that are not physical at all. So the natural world is like an elevator that can bring us up into those supernatural thoughts. So we'll focus on all that stuff as we study, but we're going to begin by just reading through chapter 1 of Aristotle's Physics. Like I said, this is not easy stuff. So sometimes we're going to run into some content that we've really got to work our way through carefully, but we're just going to take our time, make sure we understand everything at each step of the way, and in as much time as it takes, we'll work our way through Aristotle's Physics. All right, so this is chapter 1 of Aristotle's Physics, chapter 1 of book 1 of Aristotle's Physics. So follow along, take notes, jot down questions, any thoughts that come up, and we can talk about it after we're done. All right. So Aristotle writes, and this is translated by Thomas Taylor. Since about all methods or all sciences, of which there are principles or causes or elements, It happens that we obtain knowledge and science from the knowledge of these. So let's just park there for a minute and talk about the first part of this first sentence. If there's chaos, if everything is random, if everything is just happens by chance, as sometimes modern scientists like to say, well, how did the world develop? Oh, it happened by chance. Well, no one actually believes that, because if it happened by chance, there'd be nothing to study. The only reason we can study the natural world is because it doesn't happen by chance. We know that there are beginnings, we know that things develop, and we know that there are ends. We know there's a beginning of an animal's life. We know that that animal goes through maturation, it grows physically, it grows and fulfills all of its potential, and then it starts to decay and eventually dies and goes back into the earth, and that's the cycle of life. We know that there's order in the natural world. We know that it's not chance, and that's why it's worth studying. If it was just chance, there would be nothing to study, because there would just be random stuff popping up and happening all over the place. There'd be no benefit of study. So when people say, oh, this came from chance and this just they don't believe that, or they wouldn't be scientists. Because if there was just chance activity in the world, there would be nothing to study. So what Aristotle's saying here is, because there are principles and causes and elements in the natural world, principles are like, they could be either things that are just marked by the beginning. That's what principle means. It means the beginning of things, because there are beginnings, as simple as that. Maybe I don't want to make it more complicated than I need to. Principles are beginnings, causes, the origins of things, the things that actually produce change, that create motion in the world. Those are causes. And elements, that is the material things that things are built out of, because there are principles, causes, and elements in the world. We know that there are beginnings. Things break back down into their elements. We know that. We can see that. You can take a tree stump and throw it into a compost pile, and over the years, you can watch it break down and return to its elements. We can see that there are elements. We can watch things break down into their elements. We can divide things into their elements. We can take a pot of salt water and boil it, and we can watch all of the water boil out of the salt water, and we can be left with salt in the pot. We know that there are elements in things. We know there are beginnings. We know there are causes, and therefore there can be science, because there are these beginnings or causes or elements in the natural world. So because there are these things, because there are these principles, causes, and elements in the natural world, then we can gain knowledge of the natural. We can have science. We can have an orderly scientific knowledge of the natural world. So that's what Aristotle's saying there in the first sentence, because there are scientists today, and there were philosophers in Aristotle's day who suggested that the world just came from chaos, that it was random. And Aristotle says, oh, that's impossible. If it was random, you wouldn't be a scientist. So that isn't very smart to say, hi, I'm a scientist. Oh, and by the way, I believe the world all happens by chance. Well, then there's nothing to be a scientist of. So that doesn't make any sense. Aristotle then has this important statement in the parentheses here. He says, we think that we know something. We think that we know something when we know the first causes of it, when we know the first principles of it, and when, as far as to the elements, we know what it's composed of. So we say that we know something when we know its beginning, when we know its cause, when we know the elements of it. That's when we feel like we know something. If we see something that we don't know the cause of, or don't know the elements of, don't know the beginnings of, we would say, well, I don't understand that. I'm familiar with it, but I really don't understand it. To know something, what it really means to know something in a scientific way, is to know the principles, the causes, and the elements of that thing. That's what it means to know something in a scientific sense. This being the case, Aristotle says, it's obvious or evident that we should first endeavor to define these things or those things which pertain to the principles of the science concerning nature. So since we want to know the natural world, we want to know the science of the natural world, we're going to have to start by determining what the principles are. We're going to have to discover the principles of the science concerning nature. We know that there are principles, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we know what they are. So we need to investigate this question and ask, what are the principles? What are the beginnings of nature? That's what we need to investigate. So Aristotle goes on, and remember, this small print text here is just notes, and you can ignore that. Aristotle says the natural path in which we should proceed. So how should we seek this knowledge? That's the next question. How should we attempt to obtain this scientific knowledge of the natural world? Aristotle says, well, there's a natural path that human beings need to take. And it's important to note this because this is an idea that was unique to Aristotle, something that he figured out. Plato, who was his teacher, didn't agree with this. Plato taught a different way to learn these things. And this is an important part of Aristotle's philosophy. He says, there's a natural path in which we should proceed to learn these things. The natural path, he says, and this gets a little confusing, so pay attention here. He says, the natural path in which we should proceed to gain this knowledge is to move from things that are more known and manifest to us, to move beginning with things that are more known and manifest to us, and to progress to things which are more manifest and known to nature. And you see that's very weird language. So we have to try to understand what he's talking about here. What does it mean to start from things more known and manifest to us and move to things that are more manifest and known to nature? He says this is the process by which we come to know these things, by which we learn these things. And the language is just a little bit weird. So usually students who read this, they have a hard time figuring out what he's talking about. When he says things that are more known and manifest to us, you need to think about what we are. We're physical creatures. We live in bodies. We learn about things around us by means of our senses. You know, if you hear a strange noise in the middle of the night, you want to go turn a light on so you can see what it is. You know, we want to learn by means of our senses. If, you know, when you're taught that if there's ever a fire in your house and you go up to a room and the door is closed, you should feel the door or feel the doorknob to see if it's hot, to tell if there's a fire inside that room. We can learn things by feeling. We can learn things by seeing. We listen. We try to hear things and figure out what's going on. We can smell things, right? I can be sitting in my office and something could be burning, and I'll know that something is burning because I'll smell something's burning. So we learn about the natural world by means of our senses because we're physical creatures. We begin learning by our senses. That's how the process begins. And that's what Aristotle means when he says we proceed from things more known and manifest to us. That is through sensible things. We use our senses. That's where we begin learning. The problem is that most people never go beyond that. They spend their whole life learning and knowing only by the senses. So we begin learning with the senses, but the goal of real study is to progress beyond that. So we move above and beyond the senses, and we begin learning by reason, which is superior to the senses. Reason is superior because it can't be deceived. the senses can be deceived, right? You can think you see something, and then you realize, oh, I thought that was this, but actually it just looked strange. We can think we hear something. All the time, I'll experience things where I'll be doing something and I'll feel like I heard someone call my name, and I'll look around, or my wife will come in and knock on the door and say, did you call me? No, no one called you. Our senses can deceive us. We experience that all the time. Even weirder things like dreams. We can be in dreams and none of it is real, and we're having this dream, which is a fantasy of things that are going on, and we can wake up in the middle of the dream and our heart's beating and we're breathing heavy and we're sweating and we're nervous. Our physical senses can deceive us. There can be nothing going on at all, and our physical senses act as if something's going on. So senses are helpful, but God never intended for us to live by our senses, because they can be deceived. They can mislead us. You've probably had embarrassing examples where you thought you saw someone, ran up to talk to them, and then they turned around and you realize, oh, that's not Aunt Barbara, and you're embarrassed because your senses misled you. So our senses are helpful, but they're not absolutely certain. And so reason is a more certain guide. And so we start learning with our senses and we move towards reason, so that in the end, we're learning with reason almost completely disconnected from our senses. And that's the goal of philosophy, to get to that point where our studies and thoughts are pure intelligence, and we're not mingling that with the senses at all, because the senses can mislead us. Okay. So Aristotle talks about that process. And like I said, Plato didn't agree with that. Plato did not believe we should start with physical things or sensible things, but we should just try to go right to the top. And Aristotle just says that's not possible. It's not possible to get past the senses. We have to start with the senses. All right. So that's what he means there when he says the way in which we should proceed, the natural path, the necessary path, it's natural. The path we should follow is to begin with things more known and manifest to us by the senses, and progress to things which are more manifest and known to nature. And I want to talk about nature for a minute to make sure you understand what this is. Aristotle lives 350 years before Christ. Aristotle is not a Christian. He lives before Christianity. Aristotle doesn't talk about God very much, if ever. He doesn't talk about God, but when he uses this word nature, he's pretty much talking about God. If you look at the Declaration of Independence in America, you'll notice that they refer to nature's God, and they'll use capital N. They refer to God as the God of nature, nature's God. That's the idea that Aristotle is thinking of when he uses this word nature. So it would be better if the book that we're reading put a capital N at the beginning of that word nature, because when Aristotle uses the word nature, if you pay attention, you'll see that he pretty much means the same thing that we mean when we use the word God. All right. We move from things that are more known and manifest to us to things that are more manifest and known to nature or to God. Okay, so we learn by means of the senses and by reasoning. God doesn't learn by means of reasoning and senses. By means of reasoning and senses. God knows things perfectly according to pure intelligence, according to wisdom. We're trying to learn through our study. We're trying to learn to think about things the way God does. So we're moving from things that are known to us as creatures. We're trying to move to understand things that are more manifest and known to nature or to God, to think about and understand things the way God does. That's what it means to be wise. Okay, so that's what it means to proceed from things more known and manifest to us to things which are more manifest and known to nature or to God. And then he goes on to say, because for that which is known to us is not the same with that which is simply known. And again, this phrase simply known is a little bit philosophical. That word simply just means, it's like as if he says, things known to us are not the same as those that are truly known or just known in and of themselves. We actually learn about things by the senses, by comparisons, and so on. God knows things purely in themselves. We want to learn to understand and think about things the way God does. That's true knowledge, simple knowledge, not knowledge the way that we get knowledge, which is really corrupt and subject to error and all kinds of other things. Okay? Therefore, hence, it is necessary to proceed. So Aristotle's saying there's only one way to get this knowledge. It's necessary to proceed after this manner, from things that are more obscure to nature, but which are more manifest to us, to things which are more manifest and known to nature. That's the process by which we come to know natural philosophy. To us, however, things which are more confused are at first evident and clear. To us, however, things which are more confused are at first evident and clear. And what does he mean by this? What does he mean by confused? Well, the way that we use the word confused in modern society is not what he means. When we talk about being confused, we mean like we feel like we're all mixed up and we don't understand something. We say, oh, I'm confused. I really don't know what you're talking about. That's not what he means here by the word confused. By confused here, he means more like compounded together. Things are joined together. So I'll give you an example. If I go to the store and I buy a cake and I bring the cake home, and I don't mean to talk about food in the middle of the afternoon, but it's a good example. If I go to the store and buy a cake and we bring that cake home for a birthday party and we eat the cake and everybody says, oh man, that cake was delicious, right? We're talking about cake. We're looking at the cake. We may smell the cake, taste the cake, touch the cake. We're studying this cake and we know it as a cake. We know it as a whole. But that cake is actually composed of a bunch of different elements. That cake was the product of preparation. There was mixing of parts that needed to be done. They needed to be baked in the oven. Then the cake was put together and it was iced and it was decorated and all this kind of stuff. There's lots of stuff mixed up in this cake. So when I say the word cake, it's like a simple idea that I can sense. I can look at the cake, touch it, smell it, taste it, feel it, whatever I want. The cake is a whole, but it's confused. And what that means is there's a bunch of stuff joined in to this cake. There are activities that were needed. There were ingredients that were needed. There was a plan or a design for the cake that was needed. There's lots of stuff in this cake, but when I look at it, I just see a cake. A little kid at the birthday party just looks at it and says cake. But the baker thinks of it differently. Or even, mom might think of it differently if mom makes the cake. Mom might look at that cake and actually think of all of the stuff and all of the activity that's present in that cake. She might think of the eggs and the flour and the sugar and, whatever else. I'm not a baker, but whatever other elements were used to make that cake, mom sees all those elements in that cake. The little kid doesn't see that. He just sees cake. Mom sees all the ingredients. Then mom thinks about the plan that she had for the cake, that she was looking through a magazine or scrolling through some websites, trying to find a pretty cake that she could make for the birthday party. And so she had a design for that cake that she saw. When mom looks at the cake, she also can think of the design and what she was trying to do when she made the cake. Mom can also think about all of the process, all of the work that she did to make that cake. She can remember going to the grocery store and getting the ingredients, driving home, getting the cake started, putting the ingredients in the bowl, mixing the ingredients, putting them in a pan, starting up the oven, putting the things in the oven, taking it out, icing the cake, putting the decorations, putting the can. Mom sees all of that when she sees the cake, because to her, the cake is a product that consists of all of these things, the different ingredients, the plan, the activities, and so on. So the little kid looking at the cake, he sees cake. He really doesn't know about those things, probably doesn't care about those things. He sees cake. He's ready to eat. He's thinking, oh man, that's going to be yummy. That's all that he thinks about. This is what Aristotle means when he says, let me just find it real quick. To us, things which are more confused are at first evident and clear. Things which are confused are at first evident and clear. The cake is a thing that's confused. It contains all of these different principles and causes and elements. To the little kid, the cake looks simple and clear. It's just cake. If you ask him, what is that? He just says, it's cake. It's simple, right? But like I said, Mom, who made the cake, she doesn't look at it as that simple thing. She understands there's more to it. The goal of learning is to move from thinking like the kid to thinking like the mom. That's what philosophy is. Learning to look at that cake and think about it the way that the baker thinks about it, not the way that the kid thinks about it. Okay? And we do that with everything. We look outside, we look at the sky, and it's like looking at the cake. We just think about what it is. We say, what is that? We say, it's a sky. What is that? Oh, that's the moon. What's that over there? That's the sun. What's that? Oh, that's a tree. What's that over there? That's a mountain. And we look at things and we name them, but things are not that simple, right? Things are not that simple. God does not look at these things this way. God knows all kinds of things about that mountain. God knows what material the mountain was made out of. God knows the design, the plan that he had for the mountain. God knows the process by which that mountain was formed, and so on. God looks at the mountain, figuratively speaking, or God knows the mountain and all of its principles, causes, and elements. I don't know that. I look at the mountain and I say, wow, look at that big mountain. That looks really cool. That's how we begin learning. All right. To us, things which are confused, made up, or consisting of these principles, causes, and elements, at first they appear evident and clear. We actually think we understand them. If I say, hey, have you ever seen a cake? You're like, oh yeah, I know what a cake is. Do you really know what a cake is? Can you make a cake? Well, that's different, right? Can you tell me what the ingredients are in a cake? Well, that's different. Maybe I can't tell you what the ingredients are because I really don't know it. I think I know it. I'm familiar with it, but I really don't know it, right? Things that are confused are at first evident and clear to us. They appear to be evident and clear. But afterwards, from these things, from the cake, to keep with that illustration, from these things, those who divide them, and that doesn't mean we cut the cake. That's not what it's talking about. It means to take this idea of the cake and to break it down into its principles and causes and elements the way that Mom does when she thinks about that cake. Those who divide these ideas, to those who divide these ideas, the elements and the principles become known. Okay? Since Mom is the maker, she put the pieces together to make the cake. But in her mind, she can also break that cake down and explain to you the principles, causes, and elements of that cake. So at first, we see the cake, it appears evident and clear, but afterwards, by studying things which have already been made, let's say we were to interview Mom and ask her some questions. So Mom, like, why don't you explain to us how you made this cake? And she would be teaching us philosophy, as it were. She'd be explaining the nature of the cake. She'd be explaining the principles, the causes, the elements, we would learn to think of the cake the way that mom does, and we would never look at the cake the same way again. We would think of it as the maker of the cake thinks of it. Okay, that's the idea. Afterwards, those who divide these things, remember, because when we talk about the natural world, we're not making the natural world, it's already made. It's like the cake that's already made. So we're looking at it and we're saying, how was this made? What was the plan for this? What was the purpose for this? What is this made out of? Like how does a tree come to exist? Like, where does all this stuff come from? You got this big giant tree with wood and bark and branches and leaves and all acorns on it and so on. Where in the world did all that stuff come from? It came out of the earth? How in the world does that work? We don't understand the tree. We can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, listen to it if we want to, but we don't understand what that tree really is. Natural philosophy is the pursuit of the understanding of how that tree exists, what God knows about that tree. That's what we want to understand. So by this philosophy, things that are more confused and appear to us as wholes, evident and clear, we want to divide them. That word divide is another word for it, is to analyze, to break it down into these parts. And we're not just talking about physical parts, not like we're breaking a car down into the car parts. We're talking about breaking ideas down into their principles, causes, and elements. Those who divide them, they learn what those causes and elements and principles are. So Aristotle goes on, he says, on this account, because of this, it's necessary to proceed from universals, that means from the wholes, to begin with the wholes, and we do that by means of our senses, right? In our normal way of learning, especially when we're talking about natural philosophy, to begin with the universals, with the wholes, and then to move towards a knowledge of the particulars or the parts. For the whole is more known according to sense. The cake is known to our senses. The principles, causes, and elements are not originally known to our senses. We don't know what they are. We have to learn them. That which is universal is a certain kind of whole, since it comprehends many things as parts. The things of which it's made, they're kind of like parts of that thing. And so that thing is like a whole. Then Aristotle gives two examples. So that's the main idea of chapter 1. That's what he really wanted to talk about. He wanted to explain the process by which we need to study the natural world. And I think my cake illustration makes that pretty clear, how that works. The child sees the cake, it's a confused whole. He doesn't understand the principles, causes, and elements of that cake. But mom, on the other hand, when she looks at that cake, she thinks of it differently because she has wisdom with respect to the cake. She understands the principles, causes, and elements of that cake. Now just take that same comparison, that same example, and apply it to the whole natural world and to everything in the natural world. That's what we need to do in the study of natural philosophy. Reason observes order that already exists in the natural world and seeks to understand it. In the same way that that little kid looks at the finished product of the cake, and if he's interested, let's say he wants to know how he can make a cake, he's going to look at that cake and ask, how was it made? What do I need to make it? What's it made of? How did this get started? Where did this come from? And so on. Those are philosophical questions. In natural philosophy, we're doing that with everything. We're asking that question about the whole world, about every animal, every plant, all of the different parts of the natural world, outer space, the earth itself, the moon, the sun, on and on and on. We want to understand all of these things philosophically. We're seeking to understand the order in things that are already ordered by God so that we can think of them the way God does. And so now Aristotle gives us two examples to illustrate this process by which we learn. And they're a little confusing. My cake illustration is pretty clear. Aristotle's examples, you know, sometimes his examples are more confusing than the thing he's actually teaching. So what he says here is, let's think of an example. He says, these ideas, these confused wholes, they're like names. And you say, what in the world? They're like names? How is that like a name? He says, they're like names because after a certain manner or in a certain way, the whole as it relates to definition, if we think, I'm sorry, the name as it relates to definition. So if we think of the name as the cake, and if we think about the definition as all of the principles, causes, and elements of the cake, that whole thing, it's like a name. And again, this is a weird illustration because Aristotle's a genius. So the way that he thinks about things is not the way most of us think about things. We like the idea of using a cake as example. Aristotle is like, well, it's like a name, right? This is how he understands things because he's just a genius. So we've got a name. Like if we think of the name man, right? Man, that's a name. And the name man, if we look at a person and we point to a person and I say, what is that? And you say, oh, that's a man. That's a man. The man is the name, and the name is like a confused whole, right? It's just identifying that thing. But you're not identifying the essence of what a man is or talking about any of his principles, causes, or elements, right? You're not talking about what the man is. You've just given his name. It's kind of like the cake. But when we give the definition, when I say, oh yeah, well, I know it's man, but like, what is that? What do you mean man? What is man? Well, then you answer with the definition. And if you think about the definition contains the parts of man. So you say, well, man is an animal. That's the first thing you need to know about man. He's an animal. And you need to understand that he's rational. So he's a rational animal. That's what man is. And you see, what we've done is we've started with one thing, the name man, and we've divided it into a number of things. We've divided it into two different things, the genus, which is animal, and the difference, which is rational. So we started with one confused thing, and we divided it into these two parts. If you understand what I mean by parts, not physical parts, but elements or causes and principles. We've taken one thing and we've divided it. And now when I look at the man and I say, what is that? If I use the name man, I know that man means rational animal. So I don't think about man in the same way after I learn its parts. Even if I use the name man, I think of the parts when I use the name man, just as mom thinks of the cake when she thinks of all of the principles, causes, and elements of that cake. So I use the name man, and as that word is coming from my mind out my mouth, my mind is saying rational animal. I say man, I identify the thing, and my mind is right there saying rational animal. And so I understand the whole with its parts. So Aristotle uses that as an illustration of what he's explaining, just like I use the cake to illustrate it. And he gives another example here with children. He says, children also, when they're young and they're not good at distinguishing things, he says they call men fathers. They call men fathers and they call women mothers. That is, they can't distinguish different men and different women. They see a man and that little baby says dada, dada, or he refers to somebody else, he refers to another man as another dada, right? They refer to all men as fathers and all women as mothers because they can't distinguish. They don't know how to separate and identify the different people. But afterwards, Aristotle writes, afterwards, they learn to distinguish these things. They become more exact and they can tell other characteristics or attributes of a man that show he's not a father, and other characteristics of a woman that show that's not a mother, that's not my mother. So over time, they learn to identify the different parts or characteristics of those confused wholes, and they become more discriminate or more exact in their language. So that's the content of lesson 1 that Aristotle talks about here. That's the content, and he gives a couple examples to try to illustrate it. All right. It's really not difficult to understand. What's hard, if you were to read this by yourself, like when I read it myself for the first time with no one to teach me, I had to figure these things out, and it was very confusing and difficult. And if you study it by yourself, you'll feel, that it's very hard to understand what he's talking about. What does it mean to be known to us and to be known to nature? What does he mean when he says it's like a confused whole, and those who divide things, understand it? And then he uses these examples of names and children. If you study this by yourself, it's pretty difficult to understand, but I think you can see by my explanation that it's pretty simple what he's explaining. The cake illustration makes it really, really simple. And it really is that simple. I don't think I'm oversimplifying it or saying anything dumb and pretending that that's what he's talking about. I think if you think about a cake and how a child looks at a cake and how the baker looks at the cake, that's what we're talking about. We want to move from being the kid to the baker. And we want to do that for all of the natural world, so we can understand things the way God understands them, the way the maker understands them, and not as ignorant people understand them. Okay. So for example, we have to do this on the farm. I live on a farm, and this is really what farming is. You get land and you say, okay, well, now I'm responsible to make good use of this land. Well, I've got to figure out how this stuff works. How does nature actually work? What different crops can I plant on this land? What's the soil like on this land? When do the crops get planted? When do the crops get harvested? What grows well in this area? What doesn't grow well in this area? Should I have animals? What kind of animals should I have? How should I feed the animals? What do the animals need to live? Natural philosophy is studying to understand the natural world so that as a farmer, you can organize your farm so that your farm is organized by reason, so that the order that is present in the natural world can actually work on your farm. That's the goal of farming, to organize your farm in harmony with the science of nature so that everything works as it's supposed to work. That's the job of the farmer. He's the designer of the farm, and he manages and organizes the farm so everything is in the proper place. Everything is set up in the right way. We don't have things we don't need. We don't lack things that we do need. And we have the whole system that God intended in place. So for example, to get a little more specific, when you're on a farm and you've got gardens, you're planting fruits and vegetables and growing stuff. Over time, the soil starts to lose fertility. So you realize you can't just keep planting stuff and growing stuff and collecting it and planting and growing and collecting. The soil starts to lose its nutrients. And so you've got to figure out, well, how in the world can I restore the soil? And so you've got to learn, how in the natural world does God cause the soil to constantly renew itself? And we can study the natural world and see how this happens. And there's a couple different things we can see. First of all, we can look at the trees, and we can see the trees grow from the soil, and they produce fruits or nuts and leaves and all this stuff that they produce out of the soil. And what happens? Every year, all the leaves fall off, and they fall down back to the ground, and they decompose, and they return to the soil. So if we study the natural world, we can say, okay, I see how this works. So part of the fruit, or even most of the fruit, dies in the fall, falls back down to the earth, decays, and restores the soil. And the problem in my garden is that that doesn't happen. Because in my garden, I plant the seeds, I grow the fruit, then I collect the fruit. And then, most of the nutrients come away, and then I pull out all of the dead plants and I throw them all in a fire pile and burn everything. And year after year after year, my garden soil has less and less nutrients. It's less and less fertile. And so my garden gets worse and worse every year. So I can learn from nature and say, when my garden's finished, I shouldn't pull the dead plants out and throw them in the fire. I should actually put them in a pile and let them decompose, and then put that decomposed soil back into the garden. Maybe I should go and collect some leaves and put them in that pile, and I can actually make new fertile soil, because that's how the natural world works. Another way is a farmer can look out in his field, and he may have cattle out in the field, and he noticed that wherever there's cow manure, piles of cow manure in the field where the cows go to the bathroom, and we see that in the field, all of a sudden, in those places where the cows lay their manure, the grass starts to grow like crazy. There's big clumps of rich green grass in the summertime. The farmer can observe that and say, oh, so the cows, they eat the grass, they take out of the grass nutrients for their bodies, then they drop the rest of it in manure onto the ground, and that manure replenishes the soil, and that's why the grass grows so rich in those spots where the manure is. So what I can do is actually collect the cow's manure and spread it in the garden. And so cow manure is a fertilizer. And you can say, oh, that's gross, you're spreading poop in the garden. It's not gross, because the cows don't eat animal products. So you don't have all kinds of meat and stuff like that digesting. All they're eating is grass. And so their poop is just decomposed grass, just like the decomposed leaves. So farmers will collect manure and then spread it in the garden to restore the soil, or they'll drag a rake around the field and just spread the manure out so the nutrients spread through the whole field. All right. So we can learn. Yeah, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So we can learn just by watching nature, just by observing, we can see how God designed it to work. We can see how God designed it to work, and then we can use our strength and our skill to actually help it do that. So all we're doing is working to put into practice the order that already exists in the natural world, and making sure that we don't do anything that's contrary to that order, like burn all the dead plants. That's not what nature does. So we learn that that's not what we should do. We should throw them all into a pile, collect leaves and throw leaves into the pile, throw some other dirt and stuff like that onto the pile. And that pile of dead plants and leaves will turn into rich, new, fertile soil. And then we can scoop that up, spread it in the garden, and renew our garden soil. So that's what farmers have to do. They have to study to understand the order that exists in the natural world, and then organize their farm, manage their farm, so they're not doing anything that's contrary to nature, so that what they're doing is in harmony with the order that exists in the natural world. That's the challenge of farming. That's the challenge of everything. That's the challenge of being a governor. That's the challenge of being a king or the leader of a country. Your country has these resources, this land, and so on, and you have to study to understand how are they supposed to be managed. Because if we just do whatever we want, we can set up a city or set up a state that actually is contrary to nature. And anytime we set something up that's contrary to nature, nature will destroy it. If we set something up that's contrary to nature, our works will be destroyed by nature. Nature is too powerful. We are either working in harmony with nature or we're working against nature. And if we work against nature, nature will destroy everything that we do. So we have to work in harmony with nature. That study to understand the order in the natural world, that's natural philosophy. And then to actually take that knowledge and apply it to the things that we do, that's prudence. That's what it means to be prudent, to actually do things according to wisdom. That's what it means to be imprudent. So if I saw you planting corn in your garden, if I saw you planting corn in February, I would say that's not very prudent because that's not the time when corn grows. You shouldn't be planting corn in February. Corn should be planted in April. And if I see you, trying to, take a bunch of chickens and you got a chicken coop and you make a big concrete pad and then you put the chicken coop on top of the concrete and have the chickens live on concrete, I can say that's not prudent to have those chickens live on concrete. Those chickens can scratch around in the ground and they can find food for themselves and eat bugs and all kinds of stuff. And when they lay their manure, it fertilizes the ground. Those chickens should be on the ground. They should be out in the pasture walking around, eating the grass and the bugs and different plants that are out there and pooping all over the field because that replenishes the soil. They shouldn't be on concrete. That's not prudent. So that's the goal of natural philosophy, to understand the natural world. And it's true for everything we do in the natural world. How are we going to build a house? How should we transport ourselves? Are cars a good idea? Should they be electric cars? Should we use, airplanes and drones? Or should we just walk? Should we ride horses? Those questions need to be answered after we've studied natural philosophy, because if we set things up that are contrary to nature, nature is just going to destroy them. Like this idea that we're going to make gas cars. We think that was so great of an idea, and we think, well, it's we've been doing it for a long time. It was 100 years. It lasted 100 years, and it's turning out to be a terrible idea that now we're trying to get away from. So it was an idea that became popular, but it's not in harmony with nature. It was only sustainable for 100 years, and we're already moving away from it. And now the next thing is electric cars. Are electric cars a good idea? Not sure. We'll find out. Some people say it's better. Some people say it's just as bad or worse. Maybe walking and using horses in the long run, which remember was how people transported themselves for thousands of years. Maybe we're going to actually find that walking and using horses is the best form of transportation and nothing else can last. And in 200 years from now, we might find that the human race has returned to just walking and riding horses because it experimented with these other ideas, messed around with cars and trucks and gasoline and oil. That didn't work. That wasn't sustainable. Then they messed around with electric cars. When they found that didn't work, that wasn't sustainable. And finally, they just said, forget it. We're just going back to carriages and horses, and we'll walk because all of this car stuff doesn't work. That may very well happen. So we study natural philosophy to understand the order of the natural world so that all of the works that we do can be done in harmony with nature. Our health, we want to eat and drink and act in a way that's in order with nature. If we don't, we get sick. If we don't, we get injured. We have to live in harmony with nature. You can say, well, I want to live like this. Well, you can go do that. But if you're living contrary to nature, nature is going to destroy you. You have to live in harmony with nature. That's just how the world works. And that's the purpose. That's the practical purpose of the study of natural philosophy. Okay, so we're going to stop there for today. We read through chapter 1 of Aristotle's Physics. I would like you to please read through this on your own. Read through it on your own. If when you read through it, you still don't understand it, watch this video again. If you still don't understand it, write me and let me know what you're having a hard time with, or bring your question to our next class and we'll talk about it. But I want you to study this for yourself and complete the assignment. Don't just come to the live class. Go and complete the assignment, read the lesson for yourself, answer the questions, submit the assignment, get credit for this lesson. Prove you understand it by doing the assignment, and we'll move forward. We'll take one chapter or so each week. I'll do my best to explain things and make it easy for you. And then I want you to turn around and go study the lesson yourself and complete the assignment so we can move forward, okay? If this just turns out to be me talking and you watch the video and then you don't do anything, after 4 or 5 videos, I'm going to be on more complicated stuff and you're going to be lost. So it's not going to work after a while. If you keep studying as I go along, we can go through this together, but you've got to do your part, all right? So that's all today. I'm going to turn off the recording, and then if there are any questions, I'll take those questions, and then we're going to wrap up, all right? So thank you for being respectful and allowing me to get through that. Let me turn my recording off. And if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like to get into, feel free to ask.